Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Trash Talk Podcast. I'm your host, the one and only Jared. And for this podcast today, I'm joined by my fellow environmental engineers. And they are...
Hello, everyone. My name is Richie, and our segment of Trash Talk Podcast is entitled Been There, Dump That.
That's pretty clever if you ask me, but really, we're here to talk about salt. Hey, I'm Gavin.
My name is Ben. For today's episode, we are interviewing 4 different professionals on their experience or expertise within the field of desalination, and specifically the salt brine that it produces. Our interviewees include Dr. Natalie Mladenov, an environmental engineering professor here at SDSU, Dr. Ramin Yazdi, another environmental engineering professor here at SDSU, Heather McNair, an environmental scientist at the California Coastal Commission in the Energy, Ocean Resources, and Federal Consistency Division. And finally, Daniel Ellis, formerly a lead environmental scientist at the State Water Resources Control Board, and he is currently a senior environmental scientist at the Regional Water Board in San Luis Obispo.
We will be exploring processes within desalination plants, advanced water treatment systems, the saltwater brine produced from desalination as a waste product, as well as methods for their proper disposal. You won't want to miss the ending either. Make sure to stick around until the end to see how students like us can actually be a part of the global solution to an ongoing problem. So with that, let's get right into it.
For context, a single cup of ocean water contains about 2 tablespoons of salt. If you purify that same cup of water, you're left with fresh water that can be used to combat droughts and water resource issues. Even though this seems beneficial, the impacts to coastal habitats of desalination processes and the waste that it produces can be detrimental. The salt that is left behind is a saturated brine that seemingly has no other destination other than back to the ocean, where salt concentrations can skyrocket and living conditions plummet. Now there are 6 tablespoons of salt in the same cup of water, completely changing nothing less than the home of millions of coastal plants and animals. No one likes anything too salty. Think about some overly super salty fries at In-N-Out.
Yucky.
You said it, Jared. There's a reason saltwater brine is such a big problem today, just because of how much waste is left after the desalination process.
It's fascinating to think that a surplus would be a global issue. I guess it makes sense considering that this surplus is that of hazardous waste.
Bro, are you calling salt a hazardous waste? Really? It's literally just salt. I put that stuff on my food.
Salt is far more dangerous than you'd think.
I wonder if there's a way to mitigate some of the issues related to salt brine as a product and the process that creates it.
Well, Richie and I had the pleasure of talking with Dr. Natalie Mladenov about treatment and disposal strategies related to saltwater brine.
Currently, there's an ongoing global brine problem due to saltwater brine being a waste product in desalination. We had questions about how a professional engineer might see a future in tackling such a problem, and how students can take initiative on a solution.
They can try some new things.
Yeah.
There is a company that my PhD student worked for, and they looked at how can they separate these different constituents that are in the brines. And so, because you have the salts, right?
Yeah.
You also have all kinds of other metals and things like that. And so if you can kind of start to maybe separate out from the brines the things that you need, because they are in concentrated form. So imagine if gold is found there, right? If you could extract the gold from the rest of the waste, that might be might be able to pay for the treatment system that you've devised. So one of my past students, he worked for a consulting firm, and they took the calcium and silica that are in brackish. In their case, it was groundwater reverse osmosis concentrate, because sometimes we have salty groundwater, brackish groundwater, and that needs to also be dealt with. And if you're at the coast, right now, the discharge has been just to the ocean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But if you're doing a reverse osmosis treatment plant somewhere in the middle of Texas, right, where there's no coast, or in the middle of Kansas or something, what are you going to do with it? Where are you going to put it? Right. Exactly. So they were looking at a like the brackish groundwater reverse osmosis, and I guess it contained calcium and silica among other things. And so they were able to grow diatoms. They're algae that need silica and calcium. And so they were able to grow them, and that used up in that brine, and that kind of pulled out the calcium and the silica from the brine. And then I don't know how they separated the diatoms from the rest of the brines, but there's some cool, innovative ways maybe to use biology in addition to physical chemical processes to separate out the constituents in the brines, especially if they might be valuable for something. So this is this was with light. They used UV light, and so they call it photobiological treatment. So they have the photo part, the biology, and then the treating that brine. So there's a lot if you just kind of brainstorm.
Yeah. As we heard about Dr. Mladenov's past PhD student who was able to work on ways of extracting valuable constituents that are left in the saltwater from the treatment process, which could be used again. This isn't just an environmental engineering issue. So many fields can be brought in to help, like biologists in this case, that were able to grow diatoms with photobiological treatment using UV light to extract the calcium and silica. Now we just have to find ways to get the other valuable constituents out in a cost-effective way.
Professor Mladenov in this interview snippet makes it evident that it is cheaper to dump it back into the ocean if just a small percentage of these constituents are there, because the energy cost is so high. In a way, it is easier to dump brine back in the ocean if it's more liquid, but better to be landfilled if the hazardous waste has a higher solid content.
Additionally, in a podcast meant to discuss policies and regulations of saltwater brine dumping, we wanted to ask someone with expertise with hazardous materials about the different policies they have to abide by. Professor Mladenov, the director of the Water Innovation and Reuse Lab, told us about her various experiences with hazardous waste.
The ocean is just considered so vast that it will dilute, those discharges. But I think if we start really going big with desal and like all along the coast, every coast in every country, that could become a localized coastal problem where you have like hypersalination, and that might be too saline for the fish, and start hurting the fisheries.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, I think that regulations will come in, because the people who work in fisheries are going to be like, well, I have a job, there are no fish, they're all, can't handle this. I don't know what will happen, but sometimes we tend to think like that everything is going to stay the way it is now, and we don't think sustainably with more desal plants or more population growth that requires more desal plants, what will actually happen. And what about in the interior of the country where they might be doing some desal on brackish groundwater? Where's that going to go? And then, so right. I don't know if the regulations are ready to handle that scenario yet, but so maybe we're not there yet that we don't need them at this time, but maybe we will.
Yeah.
I don't know. Again, I'm a little bit out of that field.
It's going to have to see some serious adverse effects, you think, for more regulations too?
I mean, I wish we would not have to see any adverse effects, and we would just be able to model it and say, this is what's going to happen, and we need the regulations. But usually we are a few steps behind.
Yeah.
And so usually we see adverse effects and we're reactive.
Right. Okay.
As we heard, right now there's no way to gauge if the current policies are enough to handle further growth of desalination treatment plants. Therefore, it is good to keep an eye on these policies to ensure that if rapid growth in brine disposal happens in the next decade, then we will be on top of the issues and can adjust accordingly. Therefore, there will be less hypersalination around the coast, affecting the fisheries and the people.
If we focus on the logistics of desalination, cities far from the coast have more difficulties with transporting the salt water to the plants. Our second interviewee touched on the differences in efficiency between places around the world. Dr. Ramin Yazdi shared some interesting numbers regarding water resources in the Middle East.
But in different areas, and this percent is different. For example, Saudi Arabia and Dubai between 70% to 90% of their water comes from desalinated water. I mean, the source of the water is desalinated.
That's a large difference from the less than 1% that is provided by desalination in the world. You may ask why it is used so much more in other areas. Dr. Yazdi explained to us that in places that are very hot, like the Middle East, it is economically feasible due to cost-efficient solar energy. The sun's heat can also be used to evaporate the water from the brine, leaving the salty components to be dealt with.
In San Diego, on the other hand, the main desalination plant in Carlsbad creates 10% of the desalinated water that is used for drinking. Although this is a significant amount of water, especially considering the global desalinated water content being 1%, this number also speaks of a large room for improvement.
It may seem like this method doesn't help reduce the waste, but Dr. Yazdi then explains how brine can be used for better purposes.
When you have a precious metal, it worth recovery. For example, lithium is important and expensive and rare in our environment. But for example, for sodium and chloride, the cost of the treatment and extraction recovery may be larger than the value of the sodium and chloride. That is why desal plants release the brine directly into the ocean and not do recovery.
A common misconception about saltwater brine is that it is entirely composed of sodium and chlorine. While the hazardous nature of brine comes from extremely concentrated salt mixture, that is not all there is to it. Dr. Yazdi makes it clear that there are some very rare precious metals that can still be recovered from brine.
You may have heard of these precious metals before, as lithium is used in batteries, which in itself is very relevant. Given how rare lithium is, yet how much it's used in everyday life in the form of batteries, being able to salvage this metal could go a long way.
At the end of the day, a lot of aforementioned ideas are theoretical and would therefore require more research to pursue. There is still a lot about saltwater brine that we do not fully understand. Although Dr. Yazdi is right that it would be a great idea to obtain lithium from saltwater brine hazardous waste, the method to do so is still yet to be determined.
On the larger scale, the desalination plants themselves are not the kind of thing that anyone can build whenever they want. I had the privilege of speaking with Heather McNair of the California Coastal Commission and Daniel Ellis of the SLO Regional Water Board and formerly the California Water Board in Sacramento. They had some great insight into the desalination plant development and monitoring processes, as well as the various brine disposal strategies.
The outfall is a super salty discharge because you're taking out the fresh water to use for potable water and expelling super salty water. And so there's toxicity just from having high salts, but also the way the water is discharged sometimes can create issues. I'm actually going to hand it over to Daniel because the water board works much more on that outfall side of things.
Yeah, so our job as the water board is to permit discharges. And when the discharge is going to a water body as opposed to a discharge to land, we issue what's called an NPDES permit, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. So, and when we issue those, that's when we work pretty closely with the Coastal Commission and kind of vice versa on their permits. Getting at kind of the environmental impact piece, there are basically two ways the discharge can impact the marine ecosystem there, one of which is the highly salty water. And if you're curious for kind of like really getting into the nitty gritty on it, the California Ocean Plan is a regulatory document and it has various amendments to it. And one of those amendments is what we call the Desalination Amendment. And in there, it goes through all of the various impacts on like a more detailed basis about how the salinity can impact various forms of marine life. But I think the important thing to know is that our policy, our regulations, the law requires us to look at all forms of marine life. So we look at how that salinity can impact everything, right? So whether it's, charismatic megafauna or tiny little plankton, and more often than not, it's the tiny little plankton that we're looking at, and we can require mitigation for that. And then the other interesting thing about the discharge is that it comes out at a really high velocity, right? So imagine a pipe that's, 50 meters below the surface and it's shooting out brine, it's, shooting out 50 million gallons a day and it's coming out at a high velocity. That velocity generates a lot of turbulence in the water and that can also impact marine life. And so that's an additional way we have to require mitigation. So those are sort of the big impacts. But it can be a relatively localized area. But then, like Heather said, the intake piece is also really huge. But I know you're focused more on the discharge.
So you were talking about outflow and those tubes getting dumped on the ocean floor. Is there alternative strategies that are used as far as brine dumping or storage? Do you have any preference or experience with those?
Yeah, the preferred alternative would be to take your brine. So, you suck in ocean water and you desalinate it. And so what you're spitting out is basically twice the salinity of the ocean water, right? A preferred discharge would be to take that and mix it with wastewater, like, your highly treated sewage from a wastewater treatment plant, because that is basically fresh water. So if you mix the fresh water and the double salty water, you get basically ocean water salinity. So that the preference is to what we call co-mingling, where you take the brine and you take wastewater and you mix them and discharge them together. And a lot of times that makes sense just from an infrastructure perspective. If there's already a coastal wastewater treatment plant, you build the desal plant near it, and then you can just, link up your pipes. In terms of like other disposal methods, there really isn't much out there. People like to throw out the idea of like, well, just take all the salt and then, you make table salt. But that really is just economically infeasible. It's just the processes we have to make, table salt and related things are just so much simpler than trying to extract it from the brine. So pretty much the pretty much the only way to handle it that I'm aware of is discharging it back into the ocean, preferably commingled with wastewater.
And even the what Daniel mentioned before is also kind of a preference of like the jets, these subsurface jets spraying out the desal, like down near the benthos. I'm losing all my words today, sorry. But that like this jet propulsion gets you the high turbulence, so that has some effects, but it also mixes it with the ocean water pretty quickly. And so you don't get pools of briny, salty water sitting on the ocean bottom, or, rivers of brine on the ocean floor. So that is part of some of the like preferred alternatives, is having these jet expulsions, so you get that mixing zone and becomes kind of back to ocean salinity pretty quickly within a short distance of where that outfall is happening.
Hearing about the permitting process definitely offers peace of mind about the safety of our current and future desalination plants, as well as giving some interesting perspective on what actual desalination concerns and constraints are in the minds of our regulatory organizations. Additionally, the idea of a combined wastewater treatment and desalination facility is a very exciting way to deal with two issues at the same time.
Looking back on all the information we just talked about, desalination is a very interesting process with some complex science and resources behind it. The regulations surrounding desalination plants here in California is thorough and careful, which means the plants that do get approved are reasonably safe. The saltwater brine waste is not something to be ignored, though, as it has dangerous implications depending on how it is disposed of. The disposal strategies for different places around the world are often effective in relation to their climate.
From photobiological treatment to removing trace constituents to giant salt production ponds in Saudi Arabia, there are many exciting ways of creating useful products from salt brine waste. When considering releasing salt brine back into the ocean, the use of commingling waste disposal, which means combining salt brine and treated wastewater before releasing the water into the ocean, was a very intriguing prospect, as it reduces the difference between ocean water and the wastewater that is being pumped out of the treatment plants.
Finally, we want to thank all of the interviewees for sharing their wealth of knowledge and taking the time to meet with us. Please, let's give them a round of applause. We hope you learned a little something about desalination and the negative impacts it can have to our environment. Spread the word on this ongoing problem so more people are aware of the hazardous waste that is produced during desalination. That's it for this podcast. This has been There, Dump That. Signing off. Peace out, guys.